John and Jeff are going to be presenting today, and now John Wick is the founding director of the Marin Carbon Project and co-owner of the Nicasio Native Grass Ranch with his wife Peggy Rathman. His background is in construction project management, and as a founding director, Mr. Wick's role is to help launch the Marin Carbon Project and to plan, execute, and finalize projects according to deadlines and within budget. This includes acquiring resources and coordinating the efforts of steering committee members, member organizations, volunteers, contractors, and consultants in order to deliver projects according to plan. And then Jeff Creek is a co-founder of the Marin Carbon Project and a director at the Carbon Cycle Institute, where he provides senior leadership on carbon farming and land management. He brings 30 years of applied experience and theoretical training to the task of informing and facilitating the goals of the Marin Carbon Project. He is an Ag and Rangeland consultant and Natural Resources Conservation Service certified nutrient management planning specialist. Dr. Creek also holds a PhD in rangeland ecology and is a California State Board of Forestry certified professional in rangeland management. And so the reason why I asked these two guys to present today, and I'm so lucky to have you guys on the line and really appreciate your time, is they provide a neat aspect to the whole aspect of climate change, where we usually hear that ag is the problem, and the Carbon Cycle Institute, which these two are hugely involved with, is they're providing an ag is the solution perspective. So I'll let them take it away.
Okay, so I'm John Wick, and I think just for my opening remarks, I would like to share with the group what we've discovered, and it started with an observation on my ranch, working with Dr. Creek, using grazing management as a strategic tool to promote native grass populations and ground nesting bird habitat. We started observing a significant change in the function of the whole system, and Jeff was suggesting that perhaps we were increasing soil carbon from this management practice. And so we engaged Dr. Wendy Silver, a UC Berkeley biogeochemist, to explore that question. And after 6 years now, we've established that the very specific practice of providing a little bit of biologically stable carbon in the form of compost topically applied on grazed rangeland has actually resulted in a state change. And we are now measuring ongoing atmospheric carbon being transformed into carbohydrates in plants, and some of that is ending up in the more recalcitrant forms of soil carbon fractions. And this is really exciting because what it suggests is that agriculture holds the potential to actually be a solution for the climate crisis, where we're looking at atmospheric CO2 as this vast, free, untapped resource from which to produce carbohydrates, which are the foundation of food, fuel, fiber, and flora. And our science now shows that we can produce these durable goods like wool in a way that actually restores the resource base from which all of this is derived, while producing an abundance of biomass. So we've actually measured an increase in forage production of 50 to 70%, and it goes on and on from there. The water holding capacity increase is significant. And all of this is on the background of a system that has actually become a source of emission, which is grazed rangeland systems globally. So we've now observed in our control plots that the systems have become a source of emissions, where right next to them in our treatment plots, with a single application of compost in December of 2008, the trend has been reversed. And now the system is inhaling carbon on its own at a rate of around a ton per year. And the Century model suggests that would continue for 30 years, if not 100. So it's a very exciting project, great science. We've got many peer-reviewed published papers. We've got a full life cycle assessment that has established that this is extremely beneficial, and we have a protocol now for this particular practice that we've been working with. It's a SIG grant-funded effort with Environmental Defense Fund, Terra Global Capital, and our researchers, for this practice to be recognized as a greenhouse gas mitigation strategy, and perhaps provide a mechanism for land managers to participate in carbon markets. And so that's pretty much the summary, and then I think Jeff could give a nice PowerPoint here to show you guys the actual science behind this.
Okay, thanks, John. And thank you guys for taking the time to listen to us today. I should start just by describing the Marin Carbon Project as a collaborative of folks that came together in 2007 around this question of whether we could increase soil carbon through land management practices on our ag lands in Marin County. For those of you who don't know, Marin is located just north of San Francisco. We're a coastal county. A lot of land is in Puerto Rico's National Seashore and a lot in ag, and then there's a strong urban corridor to the east. Basically, the collaborative consists of the Marin Resource Conservation District, Marin Organic, University of California, Berkeley, Wendy Silver's lab, NRCS is a partner, our ag commissioners involved, UC Cooperative Extension, and of course John and Peggy at the Casio Native Grass Ranch, and the Marin Agricultural Land Trust, myself and a few other independent folks involved as well. We came together on this question of whether we could enhance carbon storage in our agricultural soils in Marin. I just wanted to start with a quick review of the carbon cycle, since everything we're doing is based on an understanding and engagement with that. And of course, we're particularly interested in the potential to transfer carbon from the atmosphere through vegetation, through the process of photosynthesis, into both vegetation, but more importantly and more interestingly for us is this soil pool, which we know if we increase soil organic matter, we initiate a whole cascade of beneficial ecosystem services, and it's those we're trying to take advantage of. So again, transferring this overabundant resource in the atmosphere through photosynthesis into the soil system where it can do some good. Why rangelands? Well, rangelands are the single largest land cover type on the planet. It also happens to be the majority of Marin County's agriculture is grassland based. It's rangeland agriculture. It's either beef production or dairy is the majority of our ag in Marin. So that's where we focused our attention. 30 to 50% of the global land area, 30 to 50% of the U.S. land area is classified as rangeland. One reason rangelands are particularly interesting from a soil carbon perspective is that grasslands globally store about a third of the world's soil carbon, and they do that because they allocate a very large percentage of their total photosynthate below ground to their root systems and to the exudates that they provide to the soil ecosystem. So grasses, because they tend to occur in semi-arid and arid systems, are very dependent on these deep root systems to supply moisture through long arid periods of the year. So they put a lot of energy into building those root systems, which in turn feeds the soil biology, including the soil mycorrhizae that are a significant sink for atmospheric carbon as it's transferred through the plant, through the root system, and then into the mycorrhizal association. Our research started by doing a pretty intensive survey of all the ag soils, the major ag soils in Marin County. We visited 22 sites in Marin and a couple in Sonoma County. We conducted 35 field surveys. We dug soil pits, sampled soil to a meter's depth, analyzed over 1,000 soil samples. We just wanted to get a sense of the scope of baseline conditions. What's the baseline soil carbon in Marin County soils? The results are on the right. On the left, what you have is a survey that was done by looking at the literature, looking at California's soil carbon across the state. As you can see, there's a similar spread, although state values tended to run from about 30 to 130 tons of carbon per hectare. Marin, we saw a slightly higher general trend from about 50 or so, or 70 tons to 270 metric tons of carbon per hectare. We were curious about the high carbon sites, and through a survey that we had conducted simultaneously with the the soil surveys, we also conducted some sociological surveys with the landowners, and we learned through that we really had two types of management, major forms of management in Marin County. That we had what we called intensive and extensive management. And the intensively managed sites had received amendments of some kind or another, some sort of topical amendment, and typically that was dairy manure. These high carbon sites were primarily on dairies or sites that had historically been the homes of dairies. So not a huge surprise that adding carbon in the form of manure would increase total soil carbon, but it helped us decide where we wanted to focus our attention going forward. We saw a net average increase of about 50 tons of carbon, additional carbon, on the manure-treated sites, and that was a significant amount of carbon. Most interestingly, and really this was new information for all of us, some of that carbon, through carbon dating, we determined that some of that additional carbon was less than a decade old, and that it was showing up in the occluded light and occluded heavy fractions in the soil carbon pool. So these are forms of carbon, organic carbon in the soil that are extremely durable. Occluded light fraction carbon can stick around for decades to centuries, and the heavy occluded heavy fraction could be there for hundreds to thousands of years. So this was really exciting news. It showed that within about a 10-year period, we could move carbon from the surface into long-term biochemically stable forms in the soil. So we decided to move forward with our research based on the background information we had, and basically our fundamental hypothesis was that organic matter additions to rangelands could measurably increase soil carbon. And the key here was measurably, because we were confident, we assumed we could increase carbon that way in soils, but the question was, would we be able to measure it? Would the difference be significant enough to show up with the measurement capabilities that we had? And then there was a sort of a hanging question of, what are the implications of increasing soil carbon? What happens if we succeed? Is that necessarily a good thing? So we proceeded by putting half an inch of compost out on our trial plots, and we did this at the Wick Ranch in Nicasio, which is a coastal prairie site. A lot of annually dominated annual plants dominate, but there are also a lot of perennial grasses in that system. And then we replicated the entire experiment up in the Sierra foothills on a very predominantly annual grassland site. So we sort of bracketed California's Mediterranean rangeland systems of the more arid foothill site and then the more mesic coastal site. Right away after the first year, or actually after the first rainy season into the first spring, we measured a significant increase in forage production, above ground forage production, as John had mentioned. So we saw an increase of 40 to 70% in that first year on the treatment plots. Interestingly, though, that biomass increase has continued every year. We're now in our sixth year of data collection, and we continue to see this dramatic increase in forage production, above ground biomass on the treated plots. We also saw an increase in below ground biomass that was significant, but not quite as dramatic as above ground. We also saw an increase in soil carbon. Now, this is soil carbon above and beyond the carbon in the compost and above and beyond the baseline carbon in the soils. So what we're seeing here is a response, is a photosynthetically driven increase in soil carbon above and beyond the compost itself, driven, we think, by a couple of factors. This carbon increase, we anticipate, based on using the DNDC model to model this out over time, we think that increase will persist for anywhere from 30 to 100 years from that, again, a single application of compost in year one. So what this slide shows is that increase in both the labile fraction, the very active, rapidly turning over carbon fraction in the soils, but also in the occluded light and occluded heavy fractions, which in this slide are referred to as the slow and the passive forms. But in all three fractions, we would anticipate continued carbon benefit out through the end of the century from that single application. We also saw an increase in soil moisture of about a 15% increase in soil volumetric water content, and we think this is probably a big part of what's driving our biomass increase and our increased rate of carbon capture. We shared this data with Drs. Allen and Lorraine Flint, who are USGS hydrologists based in Sacramento, and they were quite intrigued. And they had a very extensive data set for the Alexander Valley, which is an irrigated vineyard region just north of here. And they took our data and plugged it into their models. What you see on the lower panel on the left is anticipated trends in climatic water deficit for the Alexander Valley over the course of this century. Over the next 80 years or so, we expect that climatic water deficit to increase by about 2,000 acre-feet of unmet demand due to warming and drying conditions. The panel on the right is the impact of increasing water holding capacity by approximately that we achieved with our single application of compost. And what you see there is a net reduction in climatic water deficit equal to about a third of the anticipated increase. So in other words, we'd be alleviating the additional water demand by about 800 acre-feet, 800 of that 2,000 acre-foot anticipated increasing demand. If we were able to achieve this today, under current conditions, we'd achieve about a 450 acre-foot savings today, this year. And just coincidentally, I learned yesterday that all water withdrawal from the Russian River, the upper Russian River for vineyard production has been terminated for this year. It's not, no one's going to be allowed to irrigate out of that river. So we're dealing with a situation that's actually already upon us. We didn't anticipate it coming quite that quickly. So as we look across the state of California and try to imagine what the implications of increasing water holding capacity in our soils statewide, this gets very interesting, and the Flints are starting to work with that. And these panels you see are basically our first attempt to get a handle on that. We're anticipating an increased climatic water deficit in California of 1 million acre-feet or more by the end of the century. And we're also going to lose our snowpack, which is a major part of our water storage in California. So the question becomes, could we potentially increase our water holding capacity in our soils enough to, if not replace our snowpack, at least offset some of that lost storage volume? And this preliminary data suggests that there is the potential to make a significant contribution to water storage in California if we could increase our soil organic matter enough to increase our water holding capacity. And all this is a very complicated poster, so I'll move on from here and we maybe discuss it later. We also conducted a full life cycle assessment of the practice because clearly we could increase soil carbon with compost applications, but the question is, what are the greenhouse gas costs of doing that? So we compared, Dr. Marcia DeLange out of UC Berkeley conducted a full life cycle assessment for the practice. And what you see here is a comparison of compost, manure, and petrochemical fertilizer. As you can see, the red bar is emissions associated with each of these practices. The green is carbon sequestered as a result of the practice, and the gray is the net. The blue is avoided emissions, and compost has a huge emission avoidance component to it, in that by diverting organics away from landfill disposal and away from anaerobic manure lagoon disposal or storage, we avoid a huge methane cost associated with anaerobic decomposition of these organic materials. And so there's a total net benefit from the compost application, assuming application of 5% of California rangeland annually, we're looking at about a 28 million metric ton carbon dioxide offset from the compost practice, whereas both manure and petrochemical fertilizers have a net greenhouse gas cost associated with them. You can see we would essentially offset all the emissions from California agriculture and forestry by applying compost to 5% of California's rangelands annually. If we scale up to the state, if we look at what the implications would be across the state, and we remove the avoided emissions from the equation, assuming there was no credit for that, since it looks like that's the direction the carbon market's going, we probably won't be getting avoided emission credits for compost applications going forward. We have about 38 million acres of grassland and pasture in California. That's distinct from rangelands, which would include very arid systems and hardwood rangelands and so forth. If we just look at our grasslands and pastures, 38 million acres, if we could increase sequestration of half a ton of carbon per hectare per year, we'd be looking at 28 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent and on up. We actually achieved a sequestration rate of 3 metric tons per hectare on our foothill site plots. We had a little over about an average of 1 ton of increase on the coastal site. So these numbers are not at all unrealistic. These are actual numbers that we achieved on our test plots. And you can see what that means for offsetting some of the state's greenhouse gas footprint in comparison. So we think compost is wonderful and great, but we also know that there are a lot of other ways that we might be able to increase capture of carbon on agricultural lands. And so we've moved now into what we're calling a carbon farm planning and implementation phase, working with the Marine Resource Conservation District and the Marine Agricultural Land Trust and NRCS. We're developing what we're calling carbon farm plans for 3 demonstration farms in Marin County. We're essentially taking the NRCS conservation planning process, and putting carbon at the center of it. So we're building individual, customized, carbon-based plans for each farm, looking at all the ways we could increase carbon capture on those landscapes. We'll put this into a plan based on ecological site characteristics and soil mapping and so forth, and ultimately come up with a total plan that can be evaluated using the NRCS Common Farm model to come up to quantify the greenhouse gas benefits of the practices were we able to implement these plans. So at this point, we're looking at developing the plans, quantifying the potential carbon benefits, and then implementing, hopefully using some resources that we are able to bring to the table through the quantification of the ecosystem services associated with the implementation of these practices. This is kind of what it looks like on one of our carbon farms. This last fall, we started with the implementation of the compost application process. This is putting compost out on about 100 acres this past fall, and this is how it looks at the landscape scale. And I'll stop there. Any questions? Thanks.
So, thank you, John and Jeff, for the presentation. Does anyone have questions?
Well, what exactly does the compost consist of? I must have missed that.
Okay, the question is what's the nature of the compost? What was the original material that was used to make that compost?
Right. Good question. Originally, we used an urban green waste compost, and the reason for that was we had our experimental plots were several hundred miles apart, and we wanted to use the same compost on each site. So we purchased the material right in the middle, and that turned out to be a green waste compost in the Sacramento area. The material we're using now on our demonstration farms is a blend of dairy manure, equestrian waste, and urban green waste.
Question.
Yeah, we don't believe that there's going to be a significant difference in the effect of different types of compost, because we're specifying that the compost has to be made in accordance with our regulatory framework in California, which more or less guarantees a certain range of values for various parameters. So we're comfortable. Compost made according to those standards is what we're looking for.
So 5% of, I don't remember how many acres of rangeland, millions and millions of acres. Is there enough material, I mean, logistically, feasibly, to even come close to covering that many acres?
So the question is there enough compost available and the infrastructure for spreading that on the acres that you've calculated?
Good question. The reason I used 5% in that slide was that that's what we've calculated we can produce in California based on available organic material that's not being recycled right now. We figure we can cover about 5% of the state, or I shouldn't say of the state, of our grassland and pasture areas. So the short answer is yes, there's enough material if we choose to make it. And then from an infrastructure perspective, we used existing infrastructure to get this out in Marin this last fall, so it was an opportunity for us to test whether the available spreading material was out there, and we believe it is in most of the, certainly in most of the agricultural areas or rangelands that are associated with ag areas in the state.
I want to add on too now, the important thing here is covering 5% of the state. You'd only have to do that one time, and then you could move on to the next 5%, and then the next 5%, and over several years achieve a greater coverage area.
What about the feasibility, just cost? Has anybody done an analysis of what's the incentive? Why would people do this?
So the cost benefit is the question.
So the increased forage production at the current cost of hay in California, this would save $350 worth of hay per acre. So on year 2, it would pay for itself. And then for the next 28 years, you'd have abundant production that's excessive. So we've also done an economic analysis, and the cost of this works out to about $40 per ton of avoided, or per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. So it turns out to be, in and of itself, not cost effective until you start bringing in things like John mentioned, the avoided feed costs, increased production. We're hoping that, and I think it's realistic through the development of our protocol, that we will be able to bring additional dollars to the table through California's carbon market and other mechanisms, other ecosystem service mechanisms, that we can bring additional dollars to the table to offset the costs associated with the practices. So I'd like to add in too, what's really important here is that this was a thought exercise. We were just trying to see scientifically whether we could add carbon to soil in a more recalcitrant form. And we could, and we did. And so what we've discovered is pretty amazing, and now the moment is sharing it with groups like this group to figure out what does this mean in your community and what are other expressions of this. So, we're not proposing everybody go out and compost the world. We're just saying that what we've seen is that this mechanism is something we can manage, and when you do manage it, it's amazing. What does it mean to you?
Why don't we just add the animals back onto the grasslands instead of, because are you offsetting for the amount of emissions for making the compost and the emissions you're using to go to spread it on the land?
So there's a very important background fact that we didn't touch on. The control plots lost carbon. And this is now a global phenomenon, and this is due to 4 primary drivers. We've got a shift to annual grasses. We've got changes in temperatures. We've got late season rain events. And we have 200 years of grazing management that's caused the destruction of the soil structure a little bit. And when all of those things are added together, what we measured and what we've seen now in the literature is that rangeland systems, the single largest cover type on Earth, have become a source of greenhouse gas emissions. And with a single application of a biologically stable carbon, we're reversing that trend, and it keeps going on and on and on its own. Grazing management alone cannot do this, at least currently under our research. The control plots were grazed just as the treatment plots were. Grazing alone resulted in carbon loss from the soil system. So this is an opportunity to just ignite a state change, prime the system from a single activity, and then from then on, that grazing management does increase soil carbon.
Any other questions?
Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to just emphasize that because I didn't mention that all of our plots were grazed. We had a background history of grazing of the landscapes that we had our plots on, and we continued that grazing throughout the experiment. And there were basically two types of grazing, although I think we would probably recognize them both as very good to excellent grazing strategies. So, as John mentions, nevertheless, carbon was being lost from the control plots while it was increasing on the treatment plots.
Janet?
So my question is regarding the composted material that's applied. Is it fully composted and broken down versus maybe compost material from a static pile that isn't fully broken down?
So you mentioned a compost standard that you were utilized there in California. So can you give a little more information in regard to that standard, and then mechanically or how were these composts managed to meet that standard?
So the standard that we're referring to has to do with time and temperature and starting carbon-nitrogen ratio. That's basically codified in the state regs for the agency in California. It's called Cal Recycle, and there's detailed information on their website. The material has to go through a pathogen reduction phase, a high temperature phase, and come out of that phase and stabilize after that phase. So we're talking about a stabilized, decomposed organic material. The nitrogen content or the CN ratio of the finished material, we've actually used two different materials. One had a CN ratio of 11, and the other was 19 to 1. And we're seeing similar results with both materials.
Thank you.
Other questions?
What was the cost per acre for both the purchase or to obtain the compost and the application?
So before I answer that, I wanted to get a little more background on the use of the century model when we analyzed the results, and that suggested that 30 to 100 years this would continue. It also established that a quarter-inch application probably would have done the same thing. And so on the expanded demonstration sites, we were able to then put quarter-inch application and half-inch application out on large land areas. And we were also able to include hectare-sized exclusions, and working with Dr. Chris Potter at NASA, who's now collaborating with Dr. Silver at Berkeley. When Dr. Silver can explain biogeochemically what's happening, Dr. Potter can tell her what that looks like with remote sensing. And he was able to determine after about 3 months of the compost application that the quarter-inch and the half-inch had the same biomass response. So that's a very exciting thing. That cut the cost in half. And so with a phone call in our community, we can have a compost producer provide the materials, transport the materials, and apply the compost for around $20 to $22 a yard. And this is that challenge. We go back and forth between acres, hectares, yards, and tons. So at $20, $22 a yard, we were seeing about 32 yards of applied compost per acre on the quarter inch. And so That's basically, I think that answer your question.
So that's over $600 an acre on the quarter-inch application.
That's correct. And then if you wanted to participate in carbon markets, there's additional costs for measuring and aggregating and verifying and registering and transacting. And so all that adds up to be another $20 per ton of carbon. Now this is that conversion problem. But the hay production, or the increased forage production at the current value of $350 an acre, in 2 years that would pay for that $600 you just mentioned.
Other questions?
How about the soil water holding capacity? You know, we saw from Jeff's graph that, I mean, the water holding capacity just increased, and you know, you guys being in California, and we've heard about the droughts, I think, geez, probably daily now in the news. I mean, can you put a penny or put a dollar sign to that amount on what that soil water holding capacity means to you in a drought area or with a risk of drought?
Well, that's actually a great question, and we haven't quantified that beyond what John just mentioned, which is that additional 10 to 2 tons of forage coming off the treatment plots. At this point, with hay going for upwards of $350 a ton in California, as of last fall anyway, when things got really bad. So that's sort of the best we can do for a value right now, increased forage production. Looking down the road, you know, we can imagine the value of that being even more significant. And again, I guess I'd say that we increased soil water holding capacity by an estimated 25% or so on these plots. That was from a single practice, and we think the potential is actually much greater than that as we look at the carbon farm planning process and look at all the different ways we might increase soil organic matter and thereby increase soil water holding capacity, increasing infiltration rate, increasing hydraulic conductivity. So I don't have a direct answer for you, but I think we can speculate, and you know, the Flints are working on this question. What is the economic value of increased water holding capacity in California as we lose our snowpack is going to only get bigger and bigger over time.
More questions?
And then I know you both work with the NRCS and I'm sure state agencies. Are they seeing or is there a future to providing an incentive for carbon farming or this practice?
Yeah, great question. We are working very closely with NRCS on this, and as we're developing our plans, we are some of these practices are very specifically EQIP eligible practices. So we anticipate direct funding through EQIP for implementation of some of these practices, and we are working very closely with NRCS around the Comet Farm model, and really hope that the Comet Farm model will begin to play a greater role in NRCS decision making. So we're very hopeful, and we really kind of see a nexus developing where there will be additional funding coming in for these practices. We're also working very closely with some of our state agencies that, such as the Wildlife Conservation Board here in California, which funds practices on farm that are wildlife beneficial. And for us, things like riparian restoration, hedgerow and windbreak establishments, improved native grass cover and pasture systems, these are all recognized as wildlife beneficial by the Wildlife Conservation Board. So we're actually we're very positive. We're pretty sure we're going to get good support through the Wildlife Conservation Board. We've been in close discussion with them, and they're very excited about this concept as well.
That's great.
Last quick, this is sort of, are you working with Ellie Rilla with UC Cooperative Extension there in Marin County?
You know, Ellie, I don't know if you know, but Ellie's position as director has been taken over by David Lewis, and David Lewis is definitely a member of our team. Ellie is around, but I haven't seen too much of her in the last year or so, but we are working very closely with UC Cooperative Extension.
I wanted to add in one thing. In terms of the veg assessment, we have the data now from the plants on the treatment plots, and the plants were more nutritious. We did not see an increase of weeds, and we actually measured a decrease of medusa head up in the Sierra site.
That's great. Yeah, I'm just curious. I know you guys have visited and spoke with a bunch of producers and then also extension folks, and so now, you know, the big dollar value seems to hit folks right away and the logistics of it and whatnot, but what is the general reception that you have from people that you present this idea to kind of on the field?
It's been really positive. When we came forward with our carbon farm planning concept, we put out feelers to see whether there might be any producers interested in Marin County, and we got we had funding for to do one plan. We planned to do 3, and we got 16 interested, serious expressions of interest from producers. So there's been a lot of interest and enthusiasm from our ag community. So we're very optimistic. We also have sparked strong interest in joining Sonoma County, so we have the RCDs in Sonoma County very interested in this concept as well.
Great, yeah. Well, thank you guys so much for your time, and it was really interesting to hear your presentation.
Well, thank you, and
yeah, thank you.
please contact us if there's any other questions.
Does anyone else have any questions before we give them a hand?
Give him a hand.
All right.